The Ancient Light by Nico Smit. Chapter 1. Escape. As all the thoughts mulled through his head, Juan strolled along musing. He circled the last bend to his home, when suddenly his daydreaming was interrupted by a horrifying sound. A high-pitched, screeching growl, comparable to the sound of multiple terrified voices in one, came from the direction he was heading. At first he only froze, but after a few seconds he regained mobility and ran for cover behind a torn-down wall at the corner of the dusty road. He peeped over the bricks at his uncle's house. Juan lived with his uncle, who stayed with his most recent paramour. His mother had died about a year ago, from some illness that there were no healers to treat. He never knew his father, very few people in his time did. It was just mothers, children, and whichever man would take up the temporary role as man in the house. Catherine, his uncle's woman, had some other children, and a small baby presumably by his uncle. Even though Juan had no reason to be, he was always very fond of little Ricky, the baby boy. Juan always felt protective over the other children in the house where he grew up. Fearing for them, he studied the house from his hiding place to try and see if the sound came from within or not. Surely that sound couldn't have come from a human. He might have entered the house immediately, if he could identify the sound and its origin, but as it stood, he was caught in uncertainty and maybe a little fear. What if it's a dark creature? He did not move. Juan's protective nature sometimes led to conflict in his home, as he would get between his uncle and the children when his uncle was drunk. Of all the children, Juan had the softest spot in his heart for little Ricky. It was the baby that troubled his thoughts most of all, as he stood there indecisively. Juan frowned as he tried to see through the windows across the road, hoping to catch something of what was going on inside the house, but it was too dark behind the dusty apertures. He heard Catherine scream, something unusual for his uncle's woman as she was a hard one. This only affirmed his fears that he might have heard right the first time. He was sure the growl he heard from the house was that of an Yinka. He wouldn't dare go in. Yinkas from time to time came to villages, sowing havoc, entering houses, killing people and taking children with them as slaves. If he went in there, then he could succumb to the same fate. But what of the children? He thought to himself. Were they in the house? What of the people he knew and maybe even loved? Maybe he had to do something. But what? He heard the scream of a child and impulse overcame him. Without thinking, he dashed across the road and barged through the door of the house. There was blood all over his uncle's body that laid prostrate on the floor, motionless. Two Yenkas were standing in the room. One stooped over the body, staring at Juan. The other one was moving toward the corner, herding the rest of the people to the back of the house. Juan took in the scene with horror. As he stood there, speechless, he found himself unable to move. There was a brief moment of silence as everyone looked up at him. Then the Yinka that was standing over the body turned and walked straight to him. The creature came to a stand right before Juan, with its arms hanging besides its body, towering over him with at least 1 foot of height difference between them. It crouched down over him, its face so close that he could smell the foul breath. Juan was still frozen in dread. Run, fight, scream, his head was trying to tell him something, but his body wouldn't respond. Suddenly, the Yunka slammed his one claw up at Juan from below, hitting him in the face with a powerful backhand, bashing Juan back against the wall. Juan's sight blacked out for a second as the back of his head hit a protruding rock. Somehow, he still stood on his feet, though now leaning dizzily with his back against the wall. He was still unable to move. It was as if a pain creeped up from his neck and shot into his eye sockets. His head was thumping relentlessly. Juan blinked as his vision blurred, and he could feel a trickle of blood coming from his nose and mouth. The Yinka leaped forward and pushed him into the wall with one arm. It slowly lifted its other arm, opening its claws. Juan could see only the blurry face in front of him in the darkened house, the red eyes glowing, burning into his inner being. He could now do nothing but wait for the end, hoping it will be quick. How did it all come to this? Suddenly, there was a blue flash from Juan's right, moving into the house through the door with immense speed. The man who had barged in ran right up to the Yinka, pulling his elbow behind him with his arm raised to his shoulder. He slammed his foot down almost between the Yinka's 2 legs and bent down low. For a moment, Even though it all happened in a split second, it was as if time stood still. Juan could swear the man turned his eyes on him and made eye contact, then quickly looked back at the creature. Still in the same movement, the man heaved himself forward and up from his crouched stance, and shot his hand up until it was straight, in an almost punching motion. He thrust his glowing open palm deep into the Yinka's side. Almost as if frozen now, the man stood like a statue exactly where he planted himself for the hit, fixed in his stance, but the Yinka flew off its feet with a loud gasp, crashing the living room table into pieces and staying down motionless with a huge bleeding wound in its side. Juan stared bewildered at the creature lying on the floor, so fixated that he didn't even see what happened with the other Yinka, but the second, louder crash made him look up to see the other Yinka flying straight through the shoddy wall. The loose stones and wood in the wall crashed down near the newly formed hole as dust filled the already dim room. In the light that now shone in through the hole in the wall, he could see only the silhouette of the man, still fixed in his stance with rays of light brightening his silhouette's borders, playing through the dust particles in the air. The silhouette lifted itself, turned around and quickly walked back, heading straight at Juan. Now that the stranger stood close enough, Juan could see that the man was looking him right in the eyes. "Are you all right?" the man asked. "Yes, I think," Juan responded as he inspected his own body with his hands mechanically. The man glanced at the door as another unknown, large man also entered the dust cloud, scanning the scene and nodding. The first man looked back into Juan's eyes. "This noise will be enough to alert the others," said the man, as he grabbed both of Juan's shoulders. "The others?" Juan asked, terrified at the prospect. "There is at least one squad of Yinka in the immediate area, about 20 in all," answered the man. There was a brief pause, as if the man waited for a response from Juan, then he simply said, "We have to go now." Juan's thoughts raced in all directions. But what of the others?" he said as he pointed toward Katarin and the children. "They will be fine," responded the man quickly. "The Yinka will most certainly follow us. We are marked." Juan thought for a second. "But then I can stay," he said. "No," the man replied, a sense of urgency now sounding in his voice. "You are chosen." Juan frowned. "I am chosen? What does that?" "There is no time, we have to move now." The man cut him off, grabbing him by the arm and dragging him behind him as he ran outside the house, leaving the dust cloud and bewildered faces behind. They headed down the road and around the first corner to the left. Juan now needed no further persuasion as he heard the roar of multiple Yunkas close by. He suddenly realized that his feet could move again, so he ran with all he had in him, following the man who led the way. As they ran along, the man looked over his shoulder every now and again to check on Juan. There was another thunderous boom behind them, a sound unlike anything Juan ever heard before. The sound was not one like that of wood or rocks crashing, it was more like thunder, but somehow muffled as if in a closed space. Immediately following the sound, it felt almost as if a wave of air pushed him from behind, coming from the same direction as the sound. Still running, Juan glanced over his shoulder. He was sure he had to be mistaken in what he saw, and in the run, he could not get a decent enough look. But he could swear that he saw the second man crouching down in the dust of the road, with 3 Yinkas lying on their backs a few feet from him. What on earth was going on? He was jerked out of his thoughts as the man in front of him quickly swung sharply left, changing their direction as he grabbed Juan by the arm and dragged him behind him, leading them down a narrow pathway. Juan almost flew off his feet at the speed that the direction change took place. They now ran between 2 rows of houses, headed down the narrow corridor, then turned to their right again in the direction of the northern hills. Juan heard heavy footsteps behind him and, fearing the worst, shot a glance over his shoulder. Behind him, the other man was now following them. How on earth did he catch up so fast? And what of those other Yinka? The man was huge with arms and legs as thick as trees, and yet, somehow, he seemed to have caught up with them. "Run, laddie! Don't look back! I've got the back!" the large man shouted in a deep voice. Juan turned his gaze back to the man who led them, following behind. They entered the outer area of town, near the slopes of the northern hills. It was a very densely built area of shacks. They ran into the cluster of homes and weaved through a few of them, ignoring the shocked expressions of the locals they passed. Suddenly they found themselves in the thickets of dry bushes on the northern hill's foot, right next to the town. The man leading them kept going straight, into the bushes and up the hill. Juan and the big man followed. The branches slapped at his face and body as they ran through the bushes and continued up the hill. Juan realized that he could now feel his lungs burning. It was pure adrenaline that had kept him going this far. About 3/4 up the hill was a thicket of strong-smelling Burma bush. They ran into the Burma, the leading man crashing away through the thicket with the other two following. The Burma bush's scent made Juan's lungs burn even more, and it had already become a struggle to keep moving. On a small rock-bedded clearing in the middle of the bushes, the man in front suddenly stopped. Juan almost ran into him. "Quickly, take off your shoes," he commanded. This time around, Juan obeyed without hesitation, sensing that these men might be his only chance at survival. They all took off their shoes, and the big man took out 3 pairs of what looked like leather shoes from his backpack, handing Juan a pair. They all put on the new shoes. Juan's hands were shaking as he tied the shoes to his feet. His one eye burned as a sweat drop rolled into it. He stopped for a second to wipe the sweat off his face, then continued. The man Juan assumed to be the leader jumped up and simply said, "Come." Then he started running again. They followed without a word. Juan's lungs were burning quite heavily by now and he struggled to breathe, but luckily, it seemed like their pace was a bit slower than before. They ran through the rest of the Burma bush and continued upwards. Soon enough, they reached the top of the hill. There was a rather large boulder at the summit, and they ducked behind it. "Get down and rest, quickly while you can," said the leading man as he turned to look at Juan. Juan gladly took the chance he was given. He literally fell onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, sweat dripping from his face to the ground. The other 2 men moved to both sides of the boulder without a word. The large man peeped over it, down the hill, no doubt looking to see if their pursuers were close by. The other man had a quick glance in the same direction, then kneeled down to the ground, placed his one hand on the ground and the other on the boulder next to him. He also pressed his ear against the boulder. They did this for a while, as the party waited in silence. The only thing Juan could hear in the afternoon air was his own breathing, which was now becoming a little easier. The large man turned to the other and softly said, "I think we are safe for now." The other replied, "I agree," as the first turned around and started walking north again. The man looked over his shoulder at Juan and said, "Come, we have to reach the river before nightfall. We should be able to rest then." Juan got up and followed him without a word. They had dropped their pace to a steep walk, giving Juan some more time to regain his breath. The river? Juan thought he had only a few times in his life traveled as far as the river to the north. Why would they go to the uncle? Uncle, Juan suddenly thought back at what had just happened, realizing for the first time that his uncle was probably dead. They had been attacked by Yunka. Now he was following complete strangers into an area he would never have dreamt of going. And these strangers, who were they? It was almost impossible to believe what he saw earlier, but he was sure that they beat down those Yunka back in town. How was such a feat possible for a normal man? Were they normal at all? What was that blue flash? Some form of fire, perhaps? The questions started mulling around in Juan's head. He ran through what had happened in his mind over and over again, and every time, a new question arose that made him stop right there in the thought. Did the man say that he was chosen? What was that supposed to mean? Juan spoke quietly and uncertain of himself. I have a few questions. Without looking back, the man walking in front spoke over his shoulder. "I can imagine so, but for now it would be best if we can keep going in silence. We don't want anything to hear us, and we want to be able to hear clearly in case the creatures are tracking us." This seemed like a reasonable request to Juan. "We have to make sure we reach that river before sunset," the man continued. "Once we are sure that we are safe, tonight, then we can start answering all your questions." "Thanks," was all that Juan replied. Juan realized that this was the first time the man had spoken an actual sentence to him. Something that was very strange to Juan was that, in spite of everything that had happened, the man still sounded very calm. For some undefinable reason, Juan also thought that the man sounded friendly. Juan knew on the one hand that he had no way of survival should he return now, and on the other hand, he strangely felt like he could trust these strange men. He decided to follow them for now and see what would come of it.